वन नोट दिख रहा है?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
So yesterday we discussed these things, that is discussion on 4-bit ring and 4-bit twisted ring counters based on these block diagrams and this count sequence. Then we actually wrote the VHDL model, synthesized it and also simulated it for universal gate based NOT gate, and we clarified that it is not the size of the component that decides whether it is parent or child, but it is based on who is used to create what. So we took example of a NOR and NAND gate being converted in NOT gate. So NOR and NAND have two inputs, NOT gate has one input only. So just because NOT gate is having one input doesn't mean it has to be a child. And because NAND and NOR having two inputs, they have to be a parent. It's not like that, because we have used NAND and NOR gates to realize a NOT gate. That is why it's like that. So whoever is used to make something is actually child, and what is made is actually parent. Okay, so this is the basic rule, and we implemented it. We saw it yesterday simulation that yes, a shorted input NAND and NOR gate actually performs the function of a NOT gate. So we go to the today's agenda, which is something like this. So we are going to wind up unit number 1 after a long wait. I think if it was offline college, then we would not have spent so many lectures, because usually so this time basically we have spent a lot of time in taking coding examples. That is why the syllabus progress is little slow, but it's no problem. Today's agenda is partitioning for synthesis. Next is pipelining. Third is efficient coding styles, and fourth is packages, functions, procedures, and data objects in VHDL. So I'll not be explaining these things, but I am having some scanned notes of myself, and I'm having some PPTs which I will be uploading on the Teams. So we'll not have any discussion on this. Okay. So for explaining the topics of partitioning for synthesis, pipelining, and efficient coding styles, I'll be using a PPT. Okay. Okay. So also known as PFS, partitioning for synthesis. So what we are going to discuss now, that is partitioning for synthesis, pipelining, they're all connected to microcontroller and microprocessor concepts. And many of the terms which I'll be using in my explanation will be from the domain of microcontrollers. So you'll be well versed with some of the terms. So basically, what is partitioning and what is partitioning for synthesis? Partitioning for synthesis. So partitioning can be defined as organizing a design in terms of modules, hierarchy, and functional boundaries. So partitioning of a design can be defined as organizing a design in terms of modules, hierarchy, and functional boundaries. So this particular activity of partitioning is very important while designing especially digital or analog systems, because once the design progresses beyond a certain stage, then again changing the partitioning or hierarchy of modules become not only time consuming, but also it may prove to be very costly, because usually when systems are designed, they are designed keeping product development in mind. Okay, so if product development is in mind and the finances come into picture, and there is commerce involved in that. So there is something called as time to market. So if whether there is a new car which is to be launched, a new mobile to be launched, or you know any building also in civil engineering to be launched, then they have invested some money and then they are expecting returns to come, and there is something called as break even point. So they define that in this much, after so much time of launching the product, the break even point must be reached. Getting me? Similarly, in the world of microprocessors also, whenever a company designs a new architecture and that architecture is going to put in some finished product, then they have to have what is called as time to market. So once a particular design has been worked upon, keeping time to market in mind, then when the design reaches beyond a certain stage of progress, then making changes will become very, very difficult and it will convert into monetary loss. That is why whatever partitioning has to be done should be done in earlier stages. That is why upfront, or the first thing which is to be done in designing systems is actually partitioning. So I repeat, partitioning of a system is defined as organizing the design in terms of modules, hierarchy, and functional boundaries. So the thing is that when I use the word functional boundaries, is actually means that physically the system is one, but because within that particular system there are multiple functionalities which are integrated together to achieve the total functionality of the system, then I can modularize it. Okay, functional boundaries. So it is physically the same, but for the sake of troubleshooting, there are boundaries. For example, when you purchase a laptop or a desktop PC, at that time, or even in our smartphone, which comes with a inbuilt ROM 64 GB or whatever it is. So we usually, whenever we get a new laptop, then it is having a 1 TB of hard disk, C colon, in which there is Windows. But then we want to organize our data. So in the future, when we want to search data, it becomes very easy. Usually we have a habit of, dividing that physical 1 TB hard disk C colon into many logical partitions, that is D colon, E colon, F colon. So D colon maybe for our softwares, that installables, E colon maybe for our college data, and F colon will be entertainment. All movies and songs are there. So we also have a habit of defining boundaries for data, just for the sake of organization. Similarly, whenever any big system with very complex functionality is designed, defining functional boundaries is an inseparable part of the design process. Okay, so we usually see in the world of microprocessors and microcontrollers, the entire architecture is basically defined, classified broadly into two things. One is called as a data path, and second is called as control structures. I repeat that usually microprocessor systems architectures are partitioned into two sections. One is a data path and second is control structure. So data path is responsible for carrying the inputs to the outputs, and also responsible for performing the operations on the data. So data path carries the data from input to the output and also performs operations on that data. Okay, while the control structures or the control path or the control bus, it has got nothing to give and take with the content of the data, but it actually is responsible for configuring the data paths properly. Got the point? So control bus or control structures is responsible for configuring the data paths in a very efficient way, so that the total latency of the system is minimized and the system's throughput is actually raised. Okay, so data path and control structures work hand in hand in order to minimize the latency and increase the throughput of the system. So what is in front of you is the first method which is used for partitioning from synthesis viewpoint. So there are basically three methods for doing the partitioning efficiently from synthesis point of view. So the first method is called as partitioning between data path and control path. So we know that in any microprocessor system, we have CPU, that is control processing unit, and then we have IO unit, then we have memory, and all three of them come together to build what we call as a computer. So if we see the generic block diagram of any computing system, then it has a control processing unit, and there is ALU, I forgot. Okay, so there is control processing unit, then there is ALU, arithmetic logic unit, then there is memory, and the fourth is IO. So inputs are taken through the input unit, and it is given to the arithmetic logic unit for doing data processing, and the control processing unit will define the timings or the timing intervals when that data is fetched, instruction is fetched, and it is executed. So you all of you know, who have actually studied the architectures of microcontrollers, maybe 8051 or maybe PIC or Atmega AVR, or maybe Raspberry Pi, etc., whatever. So all microcontrollers, they have what is called as an EU. So one is called as DU, that is data unit, and second is EU, that is execution unit. So you always have, irrespective of what brand of microcontroller you are studying or you are using, there is something called as data and instructions, right? So instructions will tell what is to be done between data packets, right? So instructions have something called as instruction fetch and instruction decode. So instruction unit, IU, or execution unit, will fetch the instructions. So instruction fetch and instruction execution cycle is there. We will discuss about this more in the subsequent slides, right? So always any microprocessor, microcontroller has a data section and a control section. That is what is said here. So we see the left side rectangle is there, the standing rectangle, it has the data input, and there is pipeline stage 1 to up to n. So right from 8086, that is in 1978, when Intel launched the world's first 16-bit microprocessor 8086, it actually introduced the concept of pipelining for the first time. Anyways, way back in 1978, Intel did not have any competitors at all. So whatever Intel made in the in the field of microprocessors was like the final verdict. There was nobody to challenge it. Now Intel is having a big competition from AMD, and the media is selling that AMD has outperformed Intel, and Intel felt that yes, AMD processors are outperforming us, so they have decided to stop fabricating their processors but focusing more on their design. So Intel engineers felt that because AMD is not having its own foundry, so they are able to focus more on the performance of their processors. But because Intel is also diverting its energies to manufacturing or fabricating chips, that is why they decided that they will outsource their designs, but they will focus more on designing. So in 1978, Intel did not have any competitors, but still at that time, in 1978, its 16-bit microprocessor had a six instruction pipeline. That means there was a pipeline defined where the first six instructions were fetched, so that when the first instruction is being executed, the next six, so when the instruction number 1 was taken into the execution unit, the pipeline contained the next six instructions. When the second instruction was taken in the execution unit, the next six instructions were taken. So that is how they actually reduced their instruction execution time, reduce the latency, and thereby they improved the throughput of their processors. Okay, so instruction pipelining is not a new concept. It is actually almost 42 years old, and it has only improved over a period of time. So data path has pipelined, and then we see a data input path. It passes through many stages of pipelines, and then it ultimately appears as data output. And we see here that there is a control path which is defined by the control unit and the control bus, and there is a well-defined interface. So as I told you, that physically the system is one, but then so that you can functionally segregate them for troubleshooting and better management, there are functional boundaries defined which are actually logical in nature. So yes, here when we say well-defined interface, we do not mean only logical interface, we actually means a physical interface, because we know that control bus and data bus need not operate at the same frequencies, because sorry, So usually the number crunching speed of the microprocessor is defined by its clock frequency. So data bus has to be as fast as the clock frequency of the logic unit of the microprocessor, while control unit is only meant for configuring the data path and basically interfacing the microprocessor with the peripherals. So control path or the control bus need not operate at the same frequency as the data path. Usually it operates at a lower frequency because it is only supposed to send control signals such as address latch, or maybe enabling the data bus, or conveying the status of the peripherals, whether the peripheral is ready to accept data from the microprocessor for printing, or else whether it has completed the print job or not. So usually the control path operates at a lower frequency, but it performs the most important function of configuring the data path. That is why here we have said that the first efficient method of partitioning for synthesis is partitioning between data path and control, and between the two paths, that is data path and control path, there is a well-defined interface. Okay. Now the second method is called as clock and reset structures. So if we recall all our sequential systems for which we have written VHDL models, say for example, counters, for example. So we told that a basic counter has only clock as an input and it has an n bit output. But then we told that as we go on adding functionalities, one of the compulsory functionalities in any counter would be to have a reset and preset, right? So our counters had only one reset, one preset, and one clock. This is the standard way. That is why when we say reset, when we say reset means it should bring the system back to its original state. So usually when we press reset in a microprocessor, what happens is that all the registers are set to 0 many times. So all the instruction registers, or many times when I press the reset, then the program counter is actually set to 0000 hex. That means it points to the first location of memory, or it points to the location where the first instruction of the program is actually existing. Got the point? Usually when I say system reset, it actually means one reset. When I say preset, it means one preset. When I say clock, it means one clock. That is why ideally any system, whether small or big, should have only one type of clock and one type of reset. That is why I have said the first point is that with one type of clock and one type of a reset, that called as master clock or system clock and master reset. We usually don't have a master clock and a slave clock, or we don't have anything called as master reset and slave reset, or primary clock, secondary clock, primary reset, secondary reset, primary preset, secondary preset. No, when we say clock, it is system clock and it is one in number. When I say reset, it is master reset and one in number. So whenever we use only one clock and one reset or preset, then the problems of hazards is very rare. So I do not know how many of you have studied, or whether it was there in the yesteryears, this concept of hazards. Have you studied this concept of hazards in second year? I guess second year you should have studied hazards. Yes?
No, sir, it was not there.
It was not there. So hazards is a very important concept which has to be taken care, especially by digital designers. So usually analog systems don't face the problem of hazards, but digital systems, especially when they are designed, so even if the functionality has been achieved, still hazards and skews are two monsters which have to be taken care in a system. Okay, so on paper, even if the functionality has been achieved by writing a test bench and seeing the waveforms on the in ISIM, but still when you actually implement that system onto an FPGA or a microprocessor or a programmable logic, at that time when you actually apply the clock to the system and you actually start giving the inputs to the system in real time, at that time what happens is that either we don't get the outputs at all, or else we get outputs only partially. So some outputs are obtained, some are not obtained, because the problem may be suffering from the problem of hazards or skews. So in the future units we have a topic called as skew, And there are two kinds of skews. One is called as a signal skew and one is called as a clock skew. And what are the repercussions or consequences of skews in a system will be discussed at the later stage. So hazards are also two types, static hazard and dynamic hazard. So static hazard is basically a hazard wherein the output of a digital system actually gets stuck to zero. Okay, so although the inputs are such that output actually should be 1 theoretically, but actually it is 0. That is called a static zero hazard. Similarly, if the output of the system for all possible input combinations or for some input combination should be logic 0, and if it is coming 1, then we say that the system is suffering from a static 1 hazard. So static 0 hazard and static 1 hazards are defined as problems in a system wherein the output is supposed to remain 0 but you get a 1, and output is supposed to remain a 1 but you get a 0. Similarly, there is something called as a dynamic hazard wherein it is unpredictable whether the output will be a false 0 or a false 1. That means output is supposed to be 1 but it continuously goes on toggling between 0 and 1. For example, in your second year when you studied the conventional or the basic JK flip-flop, we know that JK flip-flop is better than SR flip-flop because SR flip-flop, it suffers from the problem of race around, and that problem is solved by JK flip-flop, but JK flip-flop starts suffering from another problem called as race around. So JK flip-flop solves the racing condition of an SR flip-flop, but itself suffers from a race around condition. So the race around condition in a JK flip-flop is solved by the master slave JK flip-flop. So when you say that race around condition, it actually means that at the active edge of the clock, that is, for example, if a JK flip-flop is positive edge triggered, then when the positive edge of the clock arrives, at that time, if j equal to k equal to 1, in such a condition, it is unpredictable to say that the output q is 0 or 1. So at one instant of time, the output may be equal to 1 at the rising edge. At another instant, when the next rising edge arrives, at that time it may be 0. Many times it goes on toggling between 1 and 0. So the unpredictable state of the output of a convention JK flip-flop at the arrival of active edge of the clock is called as a race around condition. Got the point? So this is a a simple example of dynamic hazards. So if you want to avoid static or dynamic hazards in digital systems, then it is always a recommended advice that you have only one type of a clock and one type of a reset. The second point in this particular method for partitioning for synthesis is called as with multiple clock domains and reset structures, one should partition. So for example, if it is not possible for a designer to have a single clock and a single reset, and you are forced to have multiple clock domains or multiple reset structures, then what is advised in order to reduce the problem of hazards is that you should partition the hierarchy to separate them by different modules. So if it is unavoidable to use multiple clocks and multiple reset structures, then you should partition the hierarchy and put these multiple clocks and multiple resets in different modules. Okay, so we know that ideally hazard should be 0, ideally skew should be 0, but you know that ideal conditions can never be achieved in actually real life situations. That is why we say that minimize. So one should try to minimize the skew, one should try to minimize the hazards, one should try to minimize the latency, and one should try to improve the throughput. Okay, so problem of hazards appears by mixing clock and reset types in procedural descriptions. Okay, so in the later units of the subject, we have something called as clock distribution. So clock distribution is a topic which actually suggests different ways of distributing one master clock in a design throughout the architecture of the microprocessor in such a way that the clock skew is minimized. Okay, so many a times if we see that there is a microprocessor which is a huge system having maybe 150 different modules, and all of them have to work in unison and in synchronism in order to achieve the functionality for which the microprocessor has been made. So in such a case, in order to minimize the problem of hazards, we are advised to only one clock. So there is one system clock which operates at say 3.5 or 4 gigahertz, and this clock is sitting in one corner of the architecture, and we want the edges of the clock to reach all the sequential modules which are actually clock triggered. I repeat that in a complex microprocessor architecture, the system clock or the master clock operating at 4 gigahertz is sitting in one corner of the architecture, and that particular clock's edges, positive and negative edges, are expected to reach each and every clock input of the sequential modules, which may be multiple in number at the same time. Okay, that is where the concept of clock distribution comes into picture. So H-tree distribution, then we have random structures. All these are different structures which are recommended for distributing the clock in such a way that hazards and skews are not made zero, but they are actually minimized. That is why I use the word minimizing hazards and minimizing skews. Okay, so the second method for effective partitioning for synthesis, it actually advises one clock and one reset. And if it is not possible to have one clock and one reset, but having multiple clocks and multiple resets, it is recommended that we should put the different clock domains in a hierarchical kind of a structure. Okay, that was a method number 2. And third method is called as a method of multiple instantiation. So in front of you, we are having a generic kind of a system. So purposefully I have written in the first rectangle, you see now Verilog model is there. So Verilog model, because this particular thing, module and end module, is actually the syntax for Verilog language. Okay, so as I told you that VHDL is an academic HDL and industry doesn't use it, but it has been put into the syllabus so that students learn the concept of hardware description languages. But if you join industry, then there they are using system Verilog, which is actually an advanced level of the Verilog language. So Verilog stands for Verify Logic, and it is an IEEE standard 1164, and it was standardized by IEEE in the year 1995. And just like we have VHDL 2000X series, we also have Verilog 2001 series. So this particular slide speaks about a Verilog model. So we have module and end module as the opening and closing of the Verilog program or the Verilog model. And here see carefully, I have written something: logic operations 1 on A, logic operation 2 on A, logic operation 3 on A. Then we have logic operation 1 on B, logic operation 2 on B, logic operation 3 on B. Similarly, logic operation 1 on C, operation 2 on C, and operation 3 on C. So operation 1, 2 and 3, they are 3 unique logical operations which are performed on signals A, B and C. But you see how they have been written. First section performs 3 different logical operations on A, then 3 different logical operations on B, and then 3 different logical operations on C. But we are seeing here that the logical operation 1, 2 and 3 are repeating. So logical operation 1 is performed on A, B and C. What the point? But 9 statements have been written. Okay, 9 statements have been written. So when we know that operation 1 is repeating 3 times, similarly operation 2 is repeating 3 times, and operation 3 is also repeating 3 times for 3 different chunks on data or signals. That is why I have told them they are repeated logical operations. So whenever our HDL model has this kind of things wherein a particular operation repeats itself in one single module or across modules. So here we are given example of one signal. We have given example of one single module in which 3 logical operations are repeated 3 times. I repeat, in front of us we have a single module in which 3 logical operations are repeated 3 times. It may be possible that these same 3 operations are also performed in different modules, because we see that a big system is a combination of different modules. So there may be repetition of logical operations within a single module or also across modules. In such a case, what we do is that we partition the entire module into 3 different modules, as is seen in the second rectangle, where it is written module top A, B, C. Okay, so here we have combined So logical operations 1, 2, 3 on A. So the first partition what it does is that it performs logical operations 1, 2 and 3 on A. Okay. And the second module, so it is logic of 1, 2, 3, logic of 1, 2, 3 and logic of 1, 2, 3. That is logical operations 1, 2, 3. So I have divided my single Verilog module into 3 different modules, wherein the first module will perform 3 different logical operations on A. The second module will perform 3 different logical operations on B, and the third partition will perform 3 logical operations on signal C. That is why I've written that instance 1, instance 2 and instance 3. So multiple instantiations is also an efficient technique for achieving partitioning for synthesis. Well, all these things may appear to be very nice to hear, and we may not be able to appreciate it till we actually start writing HDL models for really huge digital systems having lot of different modules, and they have interoperable functionality. Okay, so under partitioning for synthesis, we had the first solution called as separating the data path and the control path with well-defined interfaces. The second method which was suggested was that as far as possible, always have only one type of clock and one type of reset. And if it is not possible, then you can have multiple clock domains and multiple reset structures, but you should not put all the clocks in one domain or all the resets in one domain, but you should always separate the domains with a hierarchical structure. Okay, because with this, the problem of hazards may increase. Third method which was given is that if we identify that there are logical operations which are repeated within the module or across modules, then all these operations can be actually partitioned into multiple instances. That is why this technique is called as multiple instantiations. Fine. So now we come to the concept of pipelining. So as I mentioned before, that in 1978 Intel launched 8086, a 16-bit microprocessor, and it had a 6 instruction pipeline in its architecture, which actually was aimed at reducing the instruction latency and thereby improving the throughput of the microprocessor. So basically, as I told you, that pipelining is a concept which is used for saving time. Okay, so as far as modern day processors are concerned, usually they compete with each other in their technical specifications nowadays, not on the basis of clock frequency. So before about 15 years, Intel was competing with AMD for their microprocessor products based on frequency. So if Intel said that our processors are operating at 2 gigahertz, AMD said that we are better than you because our microprocessor operates at 2.1 gigahertz. And then the gigahertz war continued for some years, and we and the VLSI engineers realized that because of the limits of the transistors, that they cannot operate beyond a certain maximum frequency, they understood that the gigahertz war has to end. So from that time, Intel, AMD, as well as currently MediaTek, Qualcomm, all these microprocessor and microcontroller companies which target different product segments, they've actually shifted their competition from gigahertz war to actually other specifications such as cache memory, or what is the latest kind of a DDR which it supports. Is it okay? So the gigahertz war has actually changed into a multi-core processor war. So now they are telling, okay, you may be operating at 3 gigahertz, but you are still a single core. But we are operating at 2 gigahertz, but we are quad core. Another person says that, okay, you are 2 gigahertz quad core, and we are 1.8 gigahertz and we are octa core, or we are deca core, something like this. So that gradually the gigahertz war has actually changed into what is called as a multi-core processor war. Okay, so it's like that. So there is something called as a cache memory inside the microprocessor architecture. So if you go to Intel or AMD site and you just type the data sheet of i9 10th generation processor, or maybe AMD site Ryzen 9, so in their first page only in the technical specifications, they will mention that what is the size of L1, L2 and L3 cache. So basically this concept of cache memory is actually nothing but a very efficient implementation of the concept of pipelining. Okay, so cache memory is a efficient way of realizing the concept of pipelining. Okay, fine. So before I explain this thing, I want to say that there is something called as latency. So latency is not a word which is specific to the world of microprocessors. Latency is also defined in machines. So can you tell me what is the definition of latency? Can you define latency in the simplest terms? Latency. Yes. What is the simple definition of the word
Sir,
latency? Yes.
sir, if I apply some input, after how much time I will get the output? That's latency.
That can be called as propagation delay.
Yes,
Is
sir.
it not? If suppose I am considering a two input AND gate system, and currently the inputs are 0 and 1, so the output will be logic 0. Okay, now I change the first input from 0 to 1, right? So I change the input of AND gate from 0 to 1 at t equal to 5 nanoseconds. Then if my output changes from 0 to 1 at 5.2 nanoseconds, that means I call that there is a propagation delay of 200 picoseconds or zero point 0.2 nanoseconds in the system. Is it not? Yes or no?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, that is called as propagation delay, and the propagation delay is a very important parameter to be considered when we are trying to finalize a logic family for implementing logic. So whether I should use a TTL logic family IC, or I should use a CMOS logic family IC, or I should use an ECL logic family IC, I will have to actually go through the data sheet which speaks about power dissipation, propagation delay, fan in, fan out, noise margin, etc. Is it not? So noise margin, fan in, fan out, propagation delay, power dissipation and figure of merit. Figure of merit is a product of propagation delay in nanoseconds and the power dissipation in milliwatts. So usually the unit for figure of merit in any digital system is actually picojoules. So nanosecond into milliwatt is actually picojoules. So whichever logic family is giving me a smaller value of figure of merit in picojoules, that is what I have to select. Is it okay? So propagation delay is a very, very important parameter which helps us to make a choice between different logic families. So what you said is actually propagation delay, not the latency. Okay, so latency, yes, it is something to give and take with the delay, but what you actually define latency as is actually propagation delay of a logic gate. Okay, any other definitions of latency? Because latency is actually the most important parameter which makes 5G technology better than 4G and makes 4G technology better than 3G. Now tell me what is
Sir,
latency? Yeah.
if we talk in terms of networking, the time taken by a packet of data to get from one designated point to another, that is what latency means.
Perfect. So your definition is perfect if we want to define network latency. Very good. It is correct. So basically latency is speaking about delay. Is it okay? It is speaking about delay. Now, my question to you is, if you
Yes.
now we are discussing about architectures. We are discussing about microprocessors and microcontrollers. So as far as latency in microprocessors is concerned, how do you define that? Can you think where can this concept of latency be applied in microprocessor architectures? Where can the delay come? Can you tell me? When you say the delay, इसका मतलब है कि microprocessor has to wait for something to complete. Now I have given you hints. Okay, so when I say that define latency and hence the throughput in a microprocessor system, where do you think that the microprocessor will have to wait for some time? It will have to wait for something to finish. What is that something which should finish till that time the microprocessor remains idle? Tell me now. It's a one word answer. Yes.
Sir, for the instruction to be fetched.
Yes,
So
that's it. Instruction. Very good. That is why I told you that if you want to increase, if you want to reduce the idle time of microprocessor, that means increase throughput. So throughput of a microprocessor is inversely proportional to idle time, and idle time is directly proportional to latency. Are you getting me? So throughput is inversely proportional to idle time, and idle time is directly proportional to latency. So larger is the latency, larger is the idle time, and lower is the throughput. That is why it's correct that as far as microprocessors are concerned, the first source of latency in the system is actually the instruction. Got the point? So how much time is taken to fetch the instructions from the instruction register into the execution unit? So the first thing. Second thing, after the instruction has already arrived in the execution unit, how much time is taken for the instruction to be executed? Is it okay? Then how much time is taken after the execution of instruction for the control unit to give the necessary control signals? Is it okay? There is something called as instruction fetch time, instruction execution time, and also data fetch time. Do you agree with this? Yes or no?
yes, sir.
Yeah. So in any microprocessor system, there is memory and there is the arithmetic logic unit. Arithmetic logic unit is actually there on the microprocessor wafer. So arithmetic logic unit or the brain of the processor is actually on the chip, the main chip, and usually memory is actually outside. So memory is actually a peripheral for the microprocessor. I repeat, memory is actually the peripheral for the microprocessor. In the sense, I understand there is something called as an on-chip memory. So L1, L2, L3 cache memories are on-chip memories, and you see here their sizes are not anything more than 2 MB. I repeat that 2 MB memory size is actually an insult for the current generation, because people are speaking about 128 GB pen drives. But when it comes to the size of caches, L1, L2, L3 caches within the processor, the L1 cache is hardly 1 or 2 MB. So L1 cache actually is next to the microprocessor on the processor chip, and it is smallest. Why? Because cache memories and the logic actually they compete for space on the wafer. That is why L1, L2, L3 cache are actually memories, but they are very small in size, and if at all you need a memory larger than their capacity, then you have to go for off-chip memories. So usually data and instructions are fetched from peripherals into the microprocessor for processing, and the time is taken for the data to be fetched into the execution, right? So there is instruction fetch time, there is instruction execution time, there is data fetch time, and there is data processing time. That is why you said rightly that when we speak about the first source of latency in a microprocessor, it is actually latency due to instructions. Now when we say specifically what do you mean by instruction latency, that means how much time is taken for an instruction to be executed. Who can tell me that what is a unit for instruction latency? My question is, what is the standard unit for instruction latency? Like I said, how much time does it take for one instruction to get executed? What is the standard unit for instruction execution time or instruction latency? Tell me. Yes? No one? Okay, it is the number of clock cycles. Okay, so number of clock cycles is a unit used for defining instruction latency. So there are some instructions which get executed in one clock cycle. Some instructions take 2 clock cycles, and some instructions take 6 clock cycles. So for example, if a particular instruction in a microprocessor has a latency of 6 clock cycles, that means it is going to lock the microprocessor for 6 cycles. Got the point? So execution unit will not be available for the next instruction for the next 6 cycles. So this instruction, once it enters into the instruction execution unit and its latency is 6 clock cycles, that means for the next 6 clock cycles, this execution unit will not be available for the next instruction. And that is why the concept of multi-core processors or multitasking or parallel programming has come into picture. Anyways, I understand that parallel programming is not same as multitasking or multi-core processing. They are all three different concepts, but still I'm telling you that if there are multiple execution units which are operating in parallel, then we can actually reduce the instruction latency time. Is it clear? So here speed optimization of design can be done by pipelining. So the first point under this topic, that is speed optimization, is flip-flop to flip-flop throughput is increased by adding register stages. What is this? It is explained in the next diagram. Okay. So here we have a simple sequential system. In the upper half, we have 3 D flip-flops. We have 3 D flip-flops who are actually implementing some kind of a logic. That is why it is not same as a ring counter, which we discussed yesterday. There is some combination logic in between flop number 2 and 3. So this particular 3 flip-flop system is executing some kind of a logic. And what is happening is that because this combo logic between D flip-flop number 2 and 3 is having some inherent delay, that is called as T combo or combinational delay. So because there is a combinational logic which is connecting the output Q of the middle flip-flop and the input D of the third flip-flop, that is what will happen is that even if the 3 D flip-flops are clocked together, we see it is a synchronous system because the first, second and third D flip-flops are receiving the same clock. So the same master clock or system clock is applied to all 3 flip-flops. But the problem is that there is one combinational logic existing between the Q of second flop and the D input of the third flop. That is why what is happening is that if certain operations are to be performed simultaneously on the rising edges of the clocks, there will be a problem because there will be some delay involved. So for example, that the rising edge has come at t equal to 5 nanoseconds. The rising edge actually reaches all 3 flip-flops at t equal to 5 nanoseconds. And we see here that the output Q will actually undergo some combinational operation, and after a delay of 0.5 nanoseconds, it will reach D. So the thing is that while all 3 flip-flops are supposed to take an action at t equal to 5 nanoseconds when the rising edge of the clock is arriving, but because there is a combinational delay between the second and third flip-flop, that is why action will be taken. But the problem is that the action will be taken on a wrong input D of the third flip-flop. Getting me? So here the thing is that we have to synchronize the operations between 3 flip-flops. How do you do that? So now there is a problem. So there is no delay between the output Q of the first flop and the input D of the second flip-flop. But there is a delay between the output Q of second flip-flop and the input D of the third flip-flop. That is why in order to balance this delay, what we do is that we add an equivalent combination logic here. You see here the difference between the first and the second diagram is that now I have added a combination logic between first and second flip-flop. Why? Because by adding this combination logic, I have definitely increased the total latency or the total delay of the system, which has actually cost me a lowering of maximum operating frequency. But the problem is that not problem is that the benefit is that I have actually balanced the system. So this is called as adding balancing delays in between registers. So in the world of microprocessors, we usually don't call a flop as a flop, but we call it as a 1-bit register, right? So we are having in front of us what is called as a 3-bit memory or a 3-bit register, which is cascading between 3 1-bit registers. Okay, so that is why I have written a point here that total latency is reduced with a small increase in area. Why area? Because we see here that in the second diagram, when I say I have added combination logic can mean logic gates, or it can actually also mean latches. So sometimes latches are actually condemned in the world of synthesis because they increase the propagation delay. That is why incomplete if and if then else or incomplete case statements lead to latches, and latches are not recommended, I told you. But in such systems wherein one particular section is having some kind of a unavoidable non-zero delay, I must add a delay to balance that particular delay. Okay, that is why when I increase the combination logic, if I want to fabricate this system on a silicon wafer, then because I have added some logic gates in the system, that is why they will occupy more space. Is it okay? That is what I meant, that total latency can be reduced with a small increase in area. It is called as latency versus area trade-offs. Flip-flops are moved about logic to balance delay between register stages. This is also called as register balancing or retiming. Okay, that is why here what I have done in this particular system is that I have balanced the delays between the registers. I hope things are clear. Regular structures like pipeline memories or multipliers are identified by the synthesis tool. Okay, so regular structural pipeline memories or multipliers are identified by the synthesis tool. This is all a part of how the synthesis tool ends up giving us an optimized RTL schematic or a technology schematic, which we usually see after successfully synthesizing our VHDL model. Structures are re-architectured with redistributed logic to achieve load balancing. So many a times this particular combinational delay, which is seen in figure number 1, is also called as a load. Okay, this is also called as a load, and it has to be balanced. That is what we mean by the concept of balancing the delay in between the register stages. Okay. Yes, and the last topic which we want to touch upon is called as efficient coding styles. Now we have learned how to write a VHDL model comprising of library statements, so starting with correct block diagram, correct entity name, the correct truth table, we write the library statements, we write the entity declaration, and using different modeling styles such as BMS, DMS, SMS, and using all different kinds of clauses and structures, we actually end up writing the architecture body. We synthesize it, we see the schematics, and then after that we want to verify the functionality, so we go to write the test bench model, and we have the simulation done, and we see the waveforms, we compare the waveforms with our truth table, and we are happy that our model is functionally correct. So although we have learned basic VHDL coding, but when we start doing the modeling for bigger systems, at that time, if we do not code efficiently, what can happen is that redundancy can come in the code, and because of redundancy, extra or surplus hardware is inferred, and that much hardware is actually consumed within the FPGA. When more hardware is consumed inside the hardware, the propagation delay increases, the risk of hazards increases, there may be possibility of skews. Ultimately, the maximum operating frequency of the system comes down. That is why once you learn the basic coding styles of any HDL, then you have to go in for a more advanced stage to learn what is called as efficient coding styles. Okay, that actually comes by practice. Okay, so basically when we say about coding efficiently, it actually means the following things. First is removal of false paths. Okay, removal of false paths. That means under that we have control over critical path synthesis and checking of redundant conditions. I told that redundant conditions should be avoided within the logic. So for example, if I am writing inside that if A then do something, if C then do something, and again if I write down if A, that means what happens? Already I have defined what action is to be taken if A has some value. And if I repeat this same condition, that it is called as actually redundancy. So redundancy has to be avoided. Now this particular task of redundancy removal is actually done by the synthesis tool, because the current day or the modern day synthesis tools are very smart, and they give immediately a warning that this particular condition is repeating. Okay, then unnecessary calculations in for loops. So we have not touched upon for loops, but then you have to ultimately learn for doing the VHDL modeling of FIFO and universal shift register. Okay, so unnecessary calculations in for loops should be avoided. That means placing unchanging expressions in for loops. Okay, if a particular expression is not changing, then there is no point putting them in for, otherwise the execution time of the model goes on increasing. Okay, optimization of redundant logic. Okay, and third is avoid complex operators. Okay, relational operators are a handy tool for doing comparisons between signals, but if we can replace them with some kind of a combinational logic, it is always easy. So we will try to actually appreciate this statement by taking one particular operation, say less than or equal to, and we will see that if we can replace it with some other logic, and we will see what is the device utilization summary given by the tool for a particular target FPGA. Okay, so as far as possible, if we can use a little lengthy logic and avoid the use of relational operators such as less than or equal to, then it is also coming under the category of efficient coding styles. Arranging expression trees for minimum delay. That is what it means. So this is how it is. So these are some examples. Then we have some tree structures here, and it's very simple. That plus inside a circle indicates an adder block. You see here the first particular structure, that is I can say the second quadrant of the slide, is actually giving an output Z which is equal to A plus B plus C plus D. Okay, now see different arrangements are there. The first arrangement we have the first sum A plus B. So A plus B is added to C, and then A plus B plus C is added to D. If we see the first quadrant, here also they have used 3 adders, but I think so it is one and the same, because as far as number of adders is not reducing, we cannot say that it is an efficient coding style. So here also we are having A plus B and we have C plus D, and ultimately there is a third adder which adds A plus B to C plus D. Okay, now we see the third quadrant here. It is a huge quadrant, and we see that A plus B is added to C, A plus B plus C is again added to B, A plus B plus C plus B is added to C, and it goes on like that. At the end we have A plus B plus C plus B plus C added to D, and that is called as Z2. Okay, so one may say this is not a game, but actually if you want to understand what is there in front of us, we actually should write VHDL models for implementing the expressions, right? So here in the quadrant number 3, what is shown is that they have put one more output Z1 here. So they have defined that Z1 is actually A plus B plus C. Okay, so please understand that when I say A plus B plus C plus B, B plus B need not be B, because this is not logical or operation, it is actually addition operation. Okay, there is a difference between B or B and B plus B. B or B is B, but B plus B will be something else. It may result into a sum vector and a carry. And the last, that is the fourth quadrant, there is another structure which actually speaks about the same thing as the third quadrant structure, but actually it implements in a different way. Okay, we see here there is some improvement between the third and the fourth quadrant. In the third quadrant, in order to obtain Z2, what they have done is that they have used 5 adders, and here they have used 4 adders. So if you analyze it carefully, the repetition of operations is actually avoided between quadrant number 3 and 4. That is why in quadrant number 4, it will be giving us the same output Z2 as quadrant 3 structure, but actually it is using 1 adder less. So in essence, if we can reduce the number of complex blocks such as adders, then we can actually reduce the device utilization within the programmable logic device. So that was all from my side for the day, wherein we discuss about partitioning for synthesis, pipelining, and efficient coding styles. And as I had mentioned, packages, functions, procedures, and data objects in VHDL, this will be provided to you in your team account in the form of scanned notes and PPTs, which are very important and they are asked in the exam. Okay, thank you very much. So anybody has any questions to ask, because today's discussion was appearing not connected to VLSI at all, but it was more connected to the field of microprocessors and microcontrollers.